Probably we'll begin and the others will join us. So this is our third seminar on economic, social and economic challenges of COVID-19 pandemic. So far we have had two presentations by Professor James Galbraith and by Professor Jacques Sapir. Today, two main speakers are planned. One of them is Anton Moiseev, Professor Moiseev, who is also visiting professor of Moscow School of Economics, and he also works, and this is his main office, of forecasting of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and also Alexei Kireev, who stays in Washington. He works with IMF, and he is also our foreign professor at Moscow School of Economics. I haven't seen whether he has joined us so far or not, but hopefully he'll do so in several minutes. And the main area of discussion is that of macroeconomic aspects of the topic our discussion is focused on. I would like also to inform you about some of our plans, because so far Professor Rogov, full member of the Russian Academy of Science and the president of the Institute for USA and Canada of Russian Academy of Sciences, he agreed to make a presentation on May 8th, on next Tuesday, and Jan Scholte from Netherlands also will be one of two main speakers on that very day. And then also I have an agreement from Michael Golovnin, and as far as I understand, Rainer Martin from Germany.
Yeah, exactly. We agreed with him.
Okay, fine. So they'll be the main speakers on May 19. So we don't know yet who is going to be our speaker on May 12. So make your applications, please. And so these were some introductory words for this discussion. Now we have 65 people at our conference, and I think that we can begin. And because I haven't seen Alexei Kireev, so we have no. Anton Moiseev will be our first speaker. Anton, you are welcome. You have a presentation, Anton?
Yes, I have, and I will share it with you.
Yes, please do.
From my computer. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
And please, everybody, just switch off your sound for the time of presentation, and then we'll switch it off so that there were no interferences. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for the floor. Here is what we are going to speak about. Please tell me if there will be any problems with the sound or video, because I'm connecting to you over the cellular line, so there might be interference. We're going to talk today on macro financial shifts under pandemic, and there are a few ideas that I would like to share. First, what we have is that this crisis, I perceive it as a rather serious and not any kind of superficial, not any kind of what conspirology theories suggest, but rather a natural event that we are coping with by cooperative and discooperative measures. By cooperative measures, I mean some help, some little help, what the states and regions can provide to each other. But there are much more measures that are separating from, on all levels, from separating people on social distance to separating regions, cities, states, and even world regions. That will have a heavy toll. So at first, what's our pain now? The main problem is slowing down the economy because we're stopping consumption, we're stopping intermediate buys and logistics, which is very serious. We're stopping investment. Then the corporation and people who are not gaining any revenues, any incomes, they stop servicing their debts, and the banks receive a heavy hit. Corporations stop their buybacks. It goes straight to the market, what we see. And finally, the state does not receive tax payments. And this could have repercussions, and this could, we could go down this vicious spiral which led us once into the Great Depression. All right, so as for the severity, I have two charts just to show that it cannot be attributed to some kind of new seasonal flu. These are the data of Italian Statistical Agency, mortality data by weeks. I just put it on the chart with the previous years. And this year, 2020, is clearly very different. You see, we start from zero, right? Weekly mortality is more than doubled, has more than doubled at the peak. And probably you have seen in the Economist journal this picture. It was in the recent one, where the same is shown, attributed to different countries and regions of the world. So what I want to say, what the states, what the governments had done is not to achieve some goals, is to fight what we need here. How does it translate to the hit to the economy? There are many estimates now, and there is already some consensus forming from different sources, from IMF, from national statistical bureaus, from independent analytics. We get down to roughly the same figures. GDP on year-by-year basis goes down by 5 to 10%. In the quarter most affected, the second quarter this year, we could go down by 15 to 25%. Estimations for the USA, for example, this was the last paper I've seen, shows figures about 20 to 25% on quarterly basis. So it's in the same water. And to fight that, the governments spend really large sums of money, which could increase budget debts by 5 to 10% of GDP. Somewhere we see higher figures, like in the case of Germany probably, but on average, it's about 5 to 10% of GDP, plus what we have already. So let me remind you of this historical moment when the planes were to stop flying, 1973, the year of my birth. There was a string of hijackings, and they did not stop the planes. They installed security lines to check every passenger. And for the passengers, that was a shock. It was a shocking change. They were not accustomed totally to these checks, to somebody poking in their bags. But now we live with that. We pass these frames looking for metals, for explosives, multiple times when we try to fly somewhere. So the exit from this crisis could be technological. We don't know yet if it is possible, but it could be technological in the same way. If somebody could find a means to very quickly find the virus in terms of seconds, then we have our economy back. Because the problem with this virus is to know very quickly whether it is here beside you or not, whether this person is allowed to go to work, to fly the plane, to go to public transportation or not. So when we find this means, the problem of contagiousness is sorted. Another scenario is we don't find this technology, then we have some kind of prolonged crisis of 2 or 3 months for every country. But every country have it with a little lag. And so the production chains, supply chains are broken. That means we pass our peak, we get our economy back and running, but we don't get any supplies from another country which we are dependent upon. The last talk from Kushner, advisor to President Trump, I believe, was that now America is going to be independent, totally independent on every supply chain. They don't want to take any more risks. And that is what awaits for all of us. Here are 2 charts for the US economy. The blue line is the monetary mass. The red line is accounts payable, or what I call the real deal, the real deals. And the green line is the Fed Reserve help to the economy after 2008, or just the Fed Reserve balance. So what I want to draw your attention to is this discrepancy between the blue line and the red line. The red line is, so to say, the real economy. How many deals are really there, out there? And the blue line is how much debts do you have in your economy. What is this difference? This difference of over $4 trillion. It's around the balance of Federal Reserve. This is the expectations of future income, which went into debt, went into the market, which is by black line, but they are not supported by the deals, by the real debt that corporations owe to each other in production chains. That is why everybody was expecting, well, many people I know were expecting financial crisis this year or the next year. And they said, this discrepancy cannot continue for long. We should go down. To write off some debts, to write off the debts of the firms, the corporations which exhibited buybacks on the market. To write off incomes, to write off future incomes which are not supported by the real life. With this crisis, we had it very quickly. coming to us. This is where the market went. But it doesn't mean that our monetary mass will go down and the sheer amount of debt will go down too. Because the Federal Reserve will come here and supplement private debts with this central debt, public debt. We'll have increase of public debt, and we'll have decrease in private debts, maybe write-offs, maybe just bailouts, but the money will go further up, the market will go down, and probably there will be a second way of going down, because we do not approach now the inertial line of real economy. The real economy goes down by 10%, remember that, at least 10%. So the market could go further down. And this process of supplementing private debt with public debt is rather global. I would like to return to it further. These are some preliminary expectations of what we can meet next year's. What is the hit to financial system? We gain on security. We will gain on security, but we will lose on efficiency. And there will be imbalances. Here I described it, and I will leave it at that because this presentation will be available from this website. So I'm not going to voice all this. Post-pandemic, we will have larger reserves for intermediates, larger cash, staff, suppliers. You have to double everything, not to have your business stopped if there is a second wave. If we meet another virus in 2 years, for example. We have, I mean, as a world, we have gained efficiency, losing security. So now security costs much more. And we are going to lose some efficiency, but gain security. This is the process. We'll close our borders, look for local supply chains, look for very short logistics, legs, I'm sorry, logistic legs. If we lose efficiency, we lose interest. We lose profitability of businesses here, and we lose interest rates. So we're not going to return to high interest rates. They will be near zero. Also, because our private debt will be substituted by the public debt. Here is the last forecast of the Bank of Russia for Russia. So we are in the global context. It's probably the same figures, -4 to 6% for this year, but we have higher estimates of the decrease at our institute. And this is an estimation of the hit for the Russian banking system. Here is a situation which I wanted to discuss with you in detail, I do not have watch. Alexander Dmitrievich, how much time do I have? 2, 3 minutes, 5 minutes?
You are welcome to speak right now,
okay.
because Alexei Kireev has not joined.
Okay. Okay, then I will stop on this slide for a while.
Please.
Here are the total debts of Russian corporations in industries to the banks. And these are not all of the industries, and we do not look at household debts, only corporation debts in specific industries. Here we have estimations from our institute Vice Director Alexander Shirov, and Stolypin Institute, the estimations of the hit on cash flows, on production. By the way, just yesterday, our central bank had provided a very interesting analysis of cash flows for different industries, which is quite in line with these figures. Well, it differs because these are estimates which were made a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago maybe, and the central bank provides us monitoring, but this monitoring is quite consistent with what we have. So if these industries feel this heat of cash flow, they cannot service their debts. Direct multiplication gives us these figures on the debts in distress after 2 months of current time. In sum, we have about 13 trillion rubles in distress. On year-to-year basis, it's much less, 2 trillion. But we have non-ergodicity. It means that if we could stop the whole economy, if we could stop, give everyone this vacation for servicing the loans, and just leave 2 quarters as a month, then it could be okay. We would pass the peak, we would reopen the businesses, people would start to generate income, this income would go to banks and the system would work again. But if the business hits the immediate necessity of paying the bills, paying the taxes, and servicing the debt, then this figure is irrelevant. Just a couple of days ago, the president of our biggest bank, Sberbank, by the name of German Gref, told us that they see about 14 trillion of debts in possibly in distress. So that is very consistent with our little mathematical exercise that we made here. So if you provide liquidity and we can somehow stop the economy, slow it down, then we could come to rather low figures, which are not any excess for the banking system. They do not stress much the banking capital. If not, if we bump into non-ergodicity and businesses start to close, then we have this amount of hit. All right, so returning from Russian situation to the global situation. Public debts and private debts. Just 2 more slides to discuss. These are time periods in which we took first differences on public and private debts globally. They are summed by power of purchasing parity. Purchasing power parity in dollars. And these are the first difference. So these are the increments in claims to different sectors. I have grouped them by 4 years, not to have, this going up and down. What we see is after this crisis of 2008, some public debt has begun to substitute private debt. What we also see is that private debts after that moment had been increasing really slowly. What are the private debts? It's a belief, a trust of investors into their future incomes. They invest to gain future income. If they believe in it, they can borrow, they can make debts. If not, they do not. It's as simple as that. We had some bad debts, and the state had to come in and substitute some bad debts, bail it out. But this process did not stop. And the real growth of private debts slows down really from these lucrative years very slowly. Does it have any geographical, any local connection? Yes, it does. look here, the lower three parts of this graph is private debts, public debts, I'm sorry. They're very low on this period, and private debts are very high here. Lucrative 2002 to 2008. Of course, high-income G7 countries, the biggest providers of new debt, but East Asia, mostly China, and rest of the world are also very important. After this crisis, high-income countries, look light blue, has almost stopped to provide new debt, comparing to these years, almost stopped. But the government stepped in for them, the blue line. So, and it only could change in the last years, 2018, maybe 2019, we don't have the figures from the World Bank yet. With the East Asia, China and other countries, the yellow part is very fast growth of private debts, which had also, well, not stopped, but really slowed down after 2016. And again, the state public debt came in for them, the green part. So they're China is kind of moved to the same road that developed countries had here, who is now providing new private debt, a bit of East Asia and the rest of the world. And they will also go to public after some time. This is a kind of cycle. I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I understand that with this crisis, we'll have much slower generation of private debts in different regions, much faster generation of public debt. And these questions are what really troubles me now. Do we have enough income generated in this area to service this area? If not, then we are certain to have very low, near zero, or even negative interest rates, because otherwise the system cannot be balanced. Or we have a great crisis on public debt worldwide, and to write it off, we have some changes. I would not like to draw this scenario yet. All right, so thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Anton. Probably I haven't noticed if Alexei Kireev has joined us or not. Alexei, are you here? Not yet. Okay. Then we'll discuss what Anton has been telling us. Please, who would like to ask questions or make comments on his presentation? Victor Boris?
No, thanks.
Anton, may I begin with a question of definition you use? When you are saying about public debt, what kind of attitude, what kind of definition you use? Budgetary definition, or you include in that amount of money issued in this or that country?
No, I use the statistics of PPG, public and publicly guaranteed debt. This is quite common, and these are government bonds, bilateral debts, all other kinds of debt which can be counted. Yes.
Yeah, why I ask you, just because it seemed to me that at your first graph, you treated M2 as public debt. That's why I asked you.
Well, sorry for that. This one?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I did not mean that M2 is public debt, of course. No, I meant that M2 is created by private and public debts together. And within this money, which are generated by indebtedness, the part of the share of private debts had slowed its growth, probably with the more slow growth of, so to say, real sector, real deals. Sorry for the for this. I think that we can connect the growth of accounts payable to the real amount of deals in the economy, to the private debts. I do not have a direct correlation yet. It just seems very natural.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Please, ladies and gentlemen, you are welcome to put questions and make comments.
Yes, a couple of comments, if I may.
Oh, yes, please do.
What about inflation? You did not mention inflation forecasts in your survey, in your analysis. And do you have any breakdown, at least for the G20 countries? Because I'm pretty much interested in my country situation. Italy already has a high public debt and a lower private debt. So if it happens in Italy, it would mean we are going to reach the highest percentage in public debt, and while private debt is already going down. So I might be rather much interested in the situation of Italy from this.
Yes. Thank you for this question. In fact, what I have showed you is an aggregate of all countries that provide the statistics for the World Bank. Of course, we can take them separately, and it's no problem because the database is already out there. It's called, let me show you again. Where is it? Yeah, it's called World Development Indicators. Just, it's a big file, Excel file. Open it from their website. You see all kinds of debt there, or you can take it from IMF alternatively. It doesn't really matter much. So you can take the numbers for Italy, you can take numbers for Spain, for UK, and also please take the numbers for Japan, because what we are turning now to is maybe a Japanese case, which had negative interest rates before everyone else, which had stagnation for a long time with deflation. And how much debt they generated, especially public debt, that didn't help much the economy. There are different mechanisms to start the economy when it does not believe in generating future income. Some kind of different mechanism. But yes, case of Japan is what many people are fearing now, I believe.
Yes, Boris Porfiriev, please, you are welcome.
Thank you, Sandwich. Anton, I would like to specify one observation of yours. If I get it correct, you mentioned that these expenses and allocations of the government against this COVID-19, these are only aimed to counterfeit this crisis, but not to make some value. Did I get it correct, or you mean something else?
Could you please elaborate on not create some value?
I mean that if I got your point correct, you meant that this money spending only just to strive against the crisis, not to, well, again, to do something positive, so to speak. Okay. So at least I got your message as like this. Well, it meant something else.
Oh, this is a really complicated question. I didn't mean that the money spent now will not have any positive influence later. What I meant is now we're looking at very direct hits to demand, to consumption, hits to the production, hits to the banking sector, realty, aviation, and go on. We have industries that felt it, and they need money just to cover their bills for the time being, while they are not generating income or any revenues. We need to spend money to keep demand on some level before we're going down the spiral. And we need to provide liquidity. I do not say money here, but liquidity for the banks to cover for the these legs, how to say it, to cover for these, well, you know, they spend on, with these distress assets, as we have estimated, about 700 billion rubles a month. It's just what they have to spend without getting any new revenue. So we have to provide them with this liquidity. A usual rate of spending of emitting loans in Russian system is 2.5 to 3 trillion rubles a month. If everybody stops returning servicing their loans, we have to provide for the banks these sums to 2.5 to 3 trillion. But since some part of the economy still continues to service the loans, continues to pay the bills, it goes down to 7 billion, probably 1 trillion rubles at most. And this is liquidity. This will return. This will stay in the system, but it will turn over. But as for the money spent from the government, they will have a very long effect. They will be spent to create reserves, to create stashes, to create, you know, medical reserves, staff reserves, new hospitals, anything. But I really would like to, not to build scenarios and have guesses here, but to look at statistics at the end of the year and see what did we spend the money for, which loops they created in the economy. After that, we can build some very different models from what we have now. Very non-econometric models. Thank you.
I see. Thank you, Anton. Well, the question was, the question stems from the point that I was trying to, think about this anti-crisis program in the 2008-2009. And this anti-crisis packages involved a lot of projects that actually then, they make an impetus to the further economic developments in certain industries. I mean, there was quite constructive, not only anti-crisis, but so to speak, pro-development, so to speak. Okay, that was the one.
Exactly, yes. And China also had some really large public spending on federal and on central and on regional level for its infrastructure. Different infrastructures, not only transportation. And well, they went, they almost went into the problems with servicing this debt. Then it was substituted with central debt. They found a solution, but everybody was worried about how it will exist. In history, big public debts were written off by inflation. That's also, that was the question from our Italian friend, Marco, I believe. Will we have global inflation, which is much higher, which would be much higher? This is very probable, especially when you close borders, especially when you localize supply chains. You have much less opportunity, much less options for logistics that would drive prices higher. I'm not ready to build a model on that yet. The fork is very large, really.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anton.
Excuse me.
Dear friends, you know, Alexei Kireev has joined us, if I am correct. Alexei, are you here?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, fine. So my proposal is that now Alexei makes his presentation, and then we discuss, put questions to both speakers and discuss what they've said. Okay?
Fine.
Then, Alexei, if you want to share your presentation, do you have a presentation? Yeah?
You see it, I hope, yes?
Yes, you can share it for everybody. Yes, please, you are welcome.
Yes, I share the presentation. Do you see it?
Not yet.
Not yet.
I need to show things. Your entire screen share.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, how about now?
No.
No, not yet.
It says I'm sharing a window. Okay, let me do again. Should the host allow me to share something here so that I could?
I don't think so, because Anton had no problems, you see, and I haven't allowed.
Okay, it's coming. Okay.
Here it
You
is.
have it.
Yes,
Got it, yeah.
I've got it here on the screen.
Well,
Okay, now you have it, yes?
yes.
Okay, very good. So thank you very much for having me, and sorry for being late. We are in a full crisis mode here. I had several things to attend before our seminar. My presentation will be focused on the macroeconomics of the virus, as it says here, and we'll try to basically answer three simple questions. What has happened? Where we are now? And what is next? The answers to me are relatively simple. We are facing a public policy crisis, not just a medical crisis, but a public policy crisis. We are at an early stage of a second step of a crisis, which may become a cascading crisis. However, what is next? Protracted and very difficult recovery is still possible. Let me explain why I think so. And before that, clearly everything what I will be saying, it's basically, these are my own views on the situation, do not reflect anybody else's opinions or positions. I took a very simple timeline of what has happened. We are merely 4 months into the crisis. And we see that the cascading effect of lockdowns on economies, if you count a number of days from the start of the crisis, has started to have a very strong influence on the world economy at some point in the second half of March. The shaded horizontal area shows the 2 weeks where, in my opinion, the world crisis has started and happened. So the consecutive increase of negative impacts from China, Italy, Spain, and finally the United States with a travel ban from Europe led to a massive drop in economic activities across the world, which were extremely clearly, very clearly seen in the last 2 weeks of March. Between early March and last March, the whole world has had to revise their growth projections several times downwards. On my side, I did at least 4 different revisions just during these two weeks. And then if you see, I'm counting the number of days of lockdowns on the left-hand side. Some of them go surprisingly from 1 to 40 or something like this. I will say a couple of words about it a little bit later. Where are we now? This is basically the World Economic Outlook as it was presented just recently by the IMF. We all know that 2020 is projected now substantially worse and actually negative in terms of growth rate, -3, with a possible recovery of the global economy in 2021 and a relatively sharp economy and recovery at this point at about 6, mainly reflecting the effect of a very low base. It may or may not happen. It's anybody's guess. However, the numbers as they stand now are the way you see them on the screen. However, what does it mean for the rest of the world? Clearly, the impact will be very different across the countries. And you see that some countries, in terms of GDP growth, will be dropping. I mean, contraction actually is not growth, to 6, 7, and so on %. Europe even more, depending on whom you ask and which country you take into account. Some countries, including emerging economies and including China and India, are still in the positive. However, for the world as a whole, and I will explain why I'm taking just averages for the world a little bit later, it's about, let's say, -3 for the time being. Inflation looks okay across the world. The revision is not that important. It's almost 0, maybe even negative somewhere in Europe, almost 0 in the United States, 0 in Japan, a little bit positive in emerging economies. So not a big issue. However, fiscal deficits, if you ask me, the averages for the world are about -11 now. Clearly, it's an average temperature for the hospital. Huge deficits in the United States, Canada, China, and basically across the world in all major economies, including Europe. And clearly, these numbers are far from being certain. Finally, the good news is that the whole world actually doesn't really have a current account. So on average, it should be somewhere 0. But clearly, you see that the differentiation in terms of the current account projections are also starkly different between the United States, Russia, and emerging economies. And finally, and this is the most important part of the whole story, public debt. On average, again, it's about 120% of GDP for the world. A very different situation across the world, from 250% in Japan, 130 in the United States, and relatively low in Russia and some other countries. So let's simplify the situation to the maximum. Let's say there are no countries, forget about countries. The virus told us that there is only one world and there is only one economy in the world. And let's look at what this one economy is doing. This economy is about $100 billion, depending on how you count, at PPP rates, at the exchange rates. It doesn't really matter at this point of time. The trend is more important. This one economy, let's call it a virus economy, whatever, is contracting by about 10 trillion this year, 10% of contraction. Growth rate of this economy goes from +3 projected this year, for this year, just in January actually, to -3, the turnaround of about 6%. Inflation remains broadly the same in between the two projections. Fiscal deficit, if there is only one fiscal deficit now, expands by 10 percentage points of GDP. Of this economy, public debt goes from 120 to I don't know where. It depends on both numerator and denominator, by how much the contraction will be and by how much public debt will expand as a result of all the stimulus which are being taken. And the current account is broadly irrelevant again, because there is no the rest of the world. This economy just produces and consumes and invests everything what it can sell. the situation, if somebody asks me in my applied economics class at Moscow School of Economics, so what happens to this economy, I would say that this economy is in a deep recession and in a very big trouble. Mainly, I'm concerned about the line of growth, of course, fiscal deficit, and public debt. What does it mean practically? If we look at the numbers comparing projections for 2000 and 2001, again, between January and as they are now in April, we are talking about a loss of about 9 to 11 trillion US dollars of output in each year. What is, let's say 10 trillion, let's say 9, or whatever the number is. This is the order of magnitude. Depending on how you count, it's the joint GDP of Germany and Japan. And if you take it at purchasing power parity, it can be a GDP of India. I would like to remind that population of Germany and Japan is about 200 million, and India is 1.3 billion. If we are serious about these numbers, and we are talking about a loss of this proportion of magnitude, clearly anywhere in between 200 million and 1.3 billion of people in the world will be in very deep difficulty, very big trouble, depending, of course, on where they are. What next? Not what next. There is, of course, enormous uncertainty regarding this outlook. Enormous uncertainty. Nobody really knows what would happen. There are 3 scenarios. And actually, all these scenarios are built based on large macroeconomic models plus large epidemiology models. So they have to be combined somehow to produce something reasonable based on high-frequency indicators. 3 options. We have an option of a longer outbreak. For the time being, the assumption is that the outbreak will be only in Q2 and will moderate a little bit later in Q3 and Q4. But it can be much longer. It can be Q3 and Q4 also damaged by the outbreak. The second assumption is that there will be a new outbreak. People are talking about second wave and so on at some point in 2021. And of course, the worst assumption, if these two scenarios materialize at the same time, longer outbreak in 2020 and new outbreak in 2021. And if we look at the left chart only here, you see these are deviations from the baseline. It means that if the baseline is a recovery of about 6% in 2021, deviation of -7 means that there will be no recovery. It will be still in the negative territory. This is what it is. There are difficult questions to be asked, and I have quite a few of them in front of you. The one, and actually ask them to be answered. I don't know all the answers, but we can discuss them. First of all, was it a black swan? Was it something completely unpredictable and even worse, led by some kind of evil forces and so on? I don't think so. The World Health Organization has shown us clearly that these epidemic events are very common in the world. And this is from the annual report of 2018. More than 1,000 epidemic events across the world. And they affected all countries, including the United States, China, and so on. So if anything, public policies should be ready to confront this epidemic event. Clearly, it is not a black swan. Second, was public policy response adequate? Here I have most of issues, and you see, of course, this medieval image on the right-hand side. It was before the Renaissance period when people used for complete confinement in the 14th century to combat in all kind of disease proliferation. But the most important economic questions here to answer are the following. We have been talking about buffers, economic buffers being built and which should be built into each economy. And by and large, we claim that most countries, not all, but at least half of the countries, had enough fiscal space in their budgets. They used certain rules to manage the fiscal space and fiscal expenditure in their budgets. They use all kinds of automatic stabilizers built into their fiscal policies. The question mark is, where are all those buffers? Why those buffers either were not sufficient to be deployed immediately and to offset the impact, the outset of the crisis, or these buffers are not the adequate fiscal policy response actually to a predictable event such as like this pandemic. Second question, of course, the international reserves. Most countries, including large countries, including China, have huge international reserves. Some countries do not have international reserves. The question is, are those international reserves not sufficient, again, to fight the crisis? Or maybe these international reserves were not deployed efficiently enough and in a timely manner to fight the crisis. Globally speaking, half of countries follow floating exchange rate. The economic argument always has been, if you have a floating exchange rate, you have a natural amortizer in your system. The floating exchange rate will be able to offset whatever fluctuations will be. Clearly, the argument will be that one world, which is called the virus world, does not have an exchange rate. There is nobody to exchange with. However, individual countries do have, and the impact of crisis, as I showed in the timeline, was not simultaneous. Clearly, floating exchange rate could have done much more than they have done. And all other questions I have on this slide require very careful studies, and at this point, there is no clear answer. Whether it was a supply side crisis or demand side crisis, my impression that the initial impact of the crisis was clearly a supply side crisis, but it began, people or governments started treating it as a demand side crisis to what they actually were accustomed with, all kinds of fiscal and monetary stimulus. At the same time, I could not even buy a monitor for my home use since we are confined, we are working from home, because there is no supply of this computer monitors anymore and have not received it. Then the question is that lockdown sometimes is confused with a shutdown. Lockdown, actually there is no good translation into Russian for this. Sometimes it is translated as quarantine, sometimes it's translated like the period basically, but a lockdown is not equal to a shutdown. Lockdown led to shutdown of economies everywhere in the world, and to some extent expanded the impact of the crisis. The next one, social distancing, was confused with economic distancing. Again, if we are called, I mean, in messaging to preserve social distancing, it doesn't mean that economically we have to stay apart. Messaging, policy messaging was very, I would say, inadequate for the situation. Across the world, there was a call to stay at home. Whereas in my view, the call should have been work from home, work online from home. Do not stay at home. You know, in Russia, we have this always dichotomy whether to stay at home or to work, particularly for younger women. Clearly here, it was a misnomer. And finally, in terms of methods of treatment, should they be universal or targeted? In public policies, in particular in such issues, in such areas as energy subsidies, we have been always saying that, look, only targeted measures would work. Measures which are designed to reach specific groups of population, specific people who really need those energy subsidies. In this case, it turned out that other than the complete lockdown, which turned out to be a shutdown, known since the 14th century, is the only and the main tool to fight pandemics. Public policies didn't have any other tool. It's way too early to draw any conclusions and to point fingers. But if anything, one example would be South Korea, which I'm comparing in this yellow quadrant on the right, which has not used large large lockdowns, let's put it this way, in the economy relative to other countries. You see on the right-hand side, the example of Italy and so on, and the example of Korea. It is tracked by Google. As a result, in Korea, the turnaround of GDP, yes, of course, there will be a huge drop, but the turnaround from before April, from January to April would be only 4 percentage point drop. Whereas in G7, and I add Spain plus Russia, the drop will be about 10 percentage points. So these are clearly questions to public policy to be looked at in terms of the macroeconomic impact. And finally, the question is whether the stimulus package, and it's being broadly discussed, is really realistic. Sometimes when I look at this huge world of 100 trillion of output, and somebody tells me that their fiscal deficit will be about 13% of GDP, my first question would be, okay, who will finance all of that? There is no the rest of the world. There is only government sector and private sector. Let's divide the whole world in two parts. 1/3, just as a pure approximation, 1/3 is public, 2/3 is private. So the public sector tells us we need 10 trillion, 10% of GDP, 8 trillion, to finance, to fight the epidemic. They can borrow. To borrow where? In the private sector. There is no the rest of the world they cannot borrow from any other country. In the private sector is in a big trouble itself. Yes, there are savings here and there. These savings have to be mobilized somehow where there is enough incentive for the private sector to lend to the public sector in these huge amounts. I really doubt. And this is the fiscal part of the story. Clearly, there is also monetary stimulus. The numbers are jumping up and down, and as of yesterday, maybe you noticed that the Bank of Japan also announced virtually indefinite program of purchasing of assets, which means, I mean, from 6 trillion to infinity. This is how I put it. Monetary stimulus can be whatever they need to be, more or less, to overcome the current situation. When taking into account all of that, I recall experiences of the Asian crisis, of the Russian crisis, of the global financial crisis, and so on. It's a handy tool to put on the table huge amounts. The amounts have to impress people. The amounts have to deter panic and to say that, yes, there are strong forces behind you. It can be your national government. It can be your central bank. It can be the IMF who is put there more or less to preserve international macroeconomic stability. And the IMF has about 1 trillion in lending capacity. There are forces which will take care of you. The question is whether these numbers can be really deployed. First of all, whether financing for these numbers really exists, and secondly, whether it can be deployed in a timely manner, efficiently and quickly. Here you see the policy response packages by G20 in terms of fiscal measures and monetary measures. So these numbers are in trillions, and of course they are on budget and off budget. On budget, I mean the measures which will be taken by redeployment of revenue and expenditure. Clearly, revenue will be lower since there will be tax relief and all kinds of tax incentive. Expenditure will be highest, and there will be subsidies and all kinds of other things. However, there are off-budget measures, and these are more or less financial measures which have to be mobilized somehow, somewhere, and you are lucky if you have a central bank. Most countries, many countries in the world, and many developed countries in the world do not have their own central bank, and this is Europe, of course. But there is only one central bank for everybody, and the quality of treatment will be extremely important. The question is, how do you mobilize all that finance? And then my last point is that basically, what are the options? One is a gloomy, I mean, what is next? A little bit gloomy outcome, and it's illusion of the Hollywood movie, The Big Shot. Whether it's a free fall or some kind of cascading crisis, it's yet to be seen. As I said in the beginning of my presentation, in my view, we have passed the very first stage of public health or public policy, actually, crisis, since public policy was not ready to confront the public health crisis. And why it happened, it will have to be discussed and resolved. We are at an early stage of a debt crisis, and it is very obvious that debts of low-income countries have already largely been cancelled, simply because they will not be paid anyway. Debts of middle-income countries will have to be either rescheduled or cancelled also. Clearly, they will not be able to borrow anywhere like 10% of GDP additional. The big question will be what will happen with debts in large countries. Are we heading to a fully blown debt crisis in countries like Italy, Spain, France, and so on, and maybe even Japan? If so, what are the mechanisms of doing with this, of handling those crises? It's yet to be seen. Hopefully, we will not be getting there. Clearly, the countries with which can print their own reserve currency, and there is only 1.5 reserve currencies in the world to speak of. I mean, US dollar and half of the euro, as long as it concerns the euro area. If these central banks can print their own currencies and finance indirectly, hopefully indirectly, fiscal deficits, or at some point maybe even directly, without any particular impact on inflation, we will be broadly fine. But if this financing spins out of control and becomes really inflationary, then inflation also will clearly become a major issue for the world. The next step, and I did not touch even on that one, there is a parallel crisis, hidden crisis on oil, and clearly other commodities may follow the same suite, and there may be a commodity crisis, which will be triggered basically by these ongoing events. I don't see how real estate may not be touched by this cascade. And finally, if all of that is happening, there will be a financial crisis, which will be at the end of the cascade relative to what it was in 2009. But this is a little bit of a downside development, and clearly with good policies, I would suggest something like this. And my presentation is called Little Big, so it's an allusion to our pop group, which did not make it to Eurovision this year. But their optimism was enlightening to me. They said at some, I mean, their actually song says, "Don't be dummy, take some action, do something now." If we, meaning again, we for this big one world, take actions or take several actions in a concerted way, there may be a potential of what I call now a square root recovery. There are many letters which are floating around: L shape, V shape, W, jagged, whatever, what have you. I have my own image. This is a square root recovery. It may be then a protracted period of growth below potential from after the 2009 financial crisis, which continued all the way to 2019. And this is why you see I show this growth as it was below potential. And there are many reasons for that. Collapsing in Q2 of 2020, some recovery in Q3, and maybe a little bit of recovery, maybe a little bit higher than zero Q4 and 21, and in the medium term. Again, if policies are strong and good, and those policies are listed here: support for the health sector, lift containment measures, repair balance sheet, in particular debt, the debt situation, and definitely improve international cooperation. Without this, very little can be done. And finally, I would like to say that I really hope that based on what we have seen, at least in those slides, this little thing will not really become a big event. Now, it has already been relatively big, but we clearly don't want to make it even bigger. And there are tools to do this. These tools rest with national governments and international cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alexey. So, dear colleagues, you are welcome to make comments, to put questions to both of our speakers. May I ask a question, Alexey? May I ask you a question?
Yes.
Your measures, best policies you proposed, and they were shown on the last slide. You mentioned there lifting of containment measures. Do you think that the policy reactions everywhere have been that the countries have overestimated the danger of this pandemic, or the time has come to lift containment now?
Well, there is clearly a dichotomy, which is a false one, between life and livelihood. Clearly, the selection, there cannot be made a selection between life and livelihood. There should be both. The question is how to preserve both. I showed in my very first slide the timeline. It shows clearly that 40 days of quarantine, actually quarantine is what? It's quaranta in Italian. The medieval tool works for 40 days since the 14th century. After 40 days, something has to be done. And very strong choices, very hard choices have to be made, either to preserve the economy or basically to destroy it. And we see now that roughly, give it or take, plus minus 10, 15 days, countries in Europe are starting to reopen. Does it mean that the initial answer was way too large, disproportionate? I would not say so. I would say that simply, this is why I call it public policy crisis. Public policies have not been ready, were not ready for to answer this challenge, to meet this challenge with modern tools. The example of Korea, again, is very early to judge, shows when you do not do overall confinement, when you do testing, treating, and tracing, the three tools outside the containment, it seems to be giving better results than introducing these more or less medieval tools, you know, to treat the pandemic. But clearly the judgment is out, and frankly, I don't see any other alternative other than to reopen it.
Thank you. Please, ladies and gentlemen, you are welcome to put questions and to make comments. Well, yes, please.
Yeah, there is something here online.
Yeah, Jack, from Jack.
Online.
Yeah, James, do you think that the decision to reopen will start if it turns out that causality rates start rising again? If not, more likely that those countries will go right back on lockdown. Yes, thank you for this question. I showed a scenario saying that there may be yet another wave of the virus in 2021. And if so, clearly some kind of lockdown will have to be implemented unless, again, public policy will give us by that time. They have a year to work on it, frankly. Better tools like social tracing, like treatment, like vaccines and so on. It's a failure of public policies. So I hope that by that time, we will have much better tools than the medieval lockdown, which is being used right now. Therefore, most likely, and I hope, I keep my fingers crossed that the impact of the second wave of the virus will be substantially less than the impact of the first.
Thank you, Alexei. Here in chat, I see a comment, and in a sense, it's a question to you also, if I understand it correctly, made by Jamie Galbraith. Do you see it? It's, I'm not sure.
I just answered it. I just answered the thing, the decision to reopen. On that one?
No,
Yeah.
no, it's too early. A bit upper, a bit on the comment.
Ah, yes, there is a big one. Okay, a large one. No, I'm not sure to follow. Well, it's a big question. I need to absorb it first. Second.
Yes, please.
Ah, okay. So I think it has to do with capital controls, where the capital controls is the right tool to be used in these extreme situations, and whether they can help or they cannot help to absorb shocks. My take is the following. Clearly, it depends. It depends which country we are talking about. For developing countries, low-income countries, weak countries, capital controls in these extreme situations on a temporary basis may be the right tool to use. And maybe actually the only tool to use to avoid massive capital flight and massive disruptions to basically to the financial markets and to the whole economic livelihood. By the way, in the first 2 weeks, those I showed in the shaded area in my timeline, about 100 billion left immediately developing and emerging economies. Therefore, these controls will be appropriate. However, to what extent this should continue into the future, and to what extent it will distort resource allocation in the world economy, and to what extent it should be used by developed advanced economies, in my view, it's a big question mark. It may be appropriate for small countries. It may be not appropriate for large countries with strong policies, strong institutions, or at least those which were considered strong before the crisis. Now it's the right time to reassess actually the health of these public institutions and their policy implementation. And there is also a question on the private sector. Clearly, the situation is very different. Their debts are not forgiven or written down. Recovery of private sector will be foreclosures and so on. Yes, you know, depending again what you consider private sector. Private sector is a mixed bag of different things. When I said that the world roughly can be divided into 1/3 of public sector and 1/3 or 2/3 of the private sector, 2/3 includes everything, including state-owned enterprises, small enterprises, large enterprises, conglomerates, banks, many different things. Therefore, the issues for those different groups of representatives of the private sector will be completely different. My main concern as an economist is that debt sustainability of the private sector will be under question, and it is already under question. And if debts are not being repaid by the so-called enlarged private sector, then clearly there will be a massive impact on the financial sector with all possible repercussions for the financial and banking crisis. At the same time, and whether it's good thing or bad thing, it's again, the jury is out. The government sector, the public sector, let's put it this way, the public sector will have to expand, and it is expanding enormously now to take care of the pandemic. So maybe by the end of this, when we get out of this crisis, the world will be half and half. Half of it will be public and half of it will be private. And this will be a very different world. Whether it will be more efficient and better than we have it now, I don't know. But clearly, if public policies are not improved substantially between now and that point of time, then we will be in trouble again very soon.
Okay, thank you. Boris.
Yes,
Yes,
thank you, Alexander Mitch. Alexei, I would just love to make a minor comment. I like very much indeed your point on this specifications and between this dichotomies, just lockdown and working at home, social distance, and so on. I will strongly support because it's very, very important for the public policy and very specific steps activated by the states. And one comment I would even make it more stronger because I would differentiate. It's not really social distancing; it's physical distancing. Because people are communicating with each other. It's actually not so much social distancing, but physical distancing. Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, well, yet another consideration to be given here. Clearly, all office jobs can be, or not, most of them can be done remotely. Most manual jobs cannot be done remotely. And unfortunately, this is already a failure of the private sector. I am not blaming only the public sector. Where are all those robots? If we say that robots can replace physical manual labor, show me the robots. Ask robots to work for us. Ask me, ask us, guide these robots remotely. Why the private sector, which is supposed to have technology and robots, collapsed so fast within 2 weeks by 10 trillion? In an annual, I mean, there is a problem here with the private sector as well.
Alexei, you know, my comment is that I believe that robotization is mostly developed in this automobile manufacturing, in this automobile sector, in assembly mainly, okay? And they are suspended because of the cut of demand. So no need for robots, not from the point of supplies, but from the point of demand. So that is the reason why they were not activated, so to speak, okay? I believe this is the reason, not.
Okay. I don't see if somebody wants to put questions or make comments.
I do.
Yes, please. Michael Zhernov. Yes, Mikhail Zhernov. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, well, first of all, thanks for very comprehensive reports. Very, very interesting indeed. Look, I just wonder, well, I understand that probably you don't have some kind of a crystal ball, but anyway, did you make any comparisons, any assessments for European countries, say from country to country? From your point of view, which country has better chances to get out of this crisis while reasonably healthy, in a reasonably healthy position? And one more question. Probably you have already studied one of the most maybe important issue for European economy now. What kind of an impact of this crisis might have on the European integration?
Very important questions, very hard to answer. Clearly, I don't have a crystal ball. We are merely actually 4 months into the crisis. And to take stock of what has or has not happened, it will take yet another maybe 5 or 6 years to digest. However, what is, and yes, and with all fairness, all what we have are high frequency indicators on the pandemic itself, which is something. On the economic side, we don't have even numbers for end March. We are at end April. Most countries, other than a couple of employment indicators and so on, don't have numbers for end March. So we don't really know what even happened in end March. All what we know, I don't know, the number of trips by metro and by buses, visits to cinemas and so on. Then you have to correlate it somehow with the growth rate and whether there are correlations and whether these correlations are stable and so on is a big question mark. Therefore, it's way too early to judge who did what and who did better than the others. However, I would say the following as a generic point: small countries, I don't point to any country, but small countries with strong fundamentals and and this is very important, both policy tools at their disposal, meaning fiscal and monetary. Most likely will overcome this crisis easier than the countries with weaker fundamentals, including higher levels of debts, and only one policy tool at their own disposal, meaning fiscal policy, and no monetary policy at their disposal. Therefore, this may be a little bit of a link to your next question, what it means for Europe. Clearly, there will be some kind of reconfiguration of powers in Europe after the crisis. And the question in which direction, whether each country will have to have, again, realize that it's better to have two tools than to have only one tool. And we'll go back to some kind of monetary independence. I don't want to predict anything. Or the other way around. Either it will be more or less one country with one fiscal policy and one monetary policy, managed somehow centrally. But of course, I mean, it's anybody's guess.
Okay.
Thank you. I see Victor raised his hand. Who is Victor? I'm not sure I know. And his microphone is off at the same time, but his hand is up. Okay.
Could I ask a question?
Oh, Victor Mevich.
Victor Mevich.
You.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My question is as follows. It is clear that low-income countries, developing countries, cannot be prepared enough for such kind of crisis. Does it mean that we need radical changes in international relations to prevent such kind of crisis?
Yes, I understand what you mean by that, and let me try to respond. Here, the question is again a little bit of a division of labor. What can be done by national authorities and what can be done internationally by development partners, by donors, and international institutions for those countries who clearly cannot handle this crisis of this magnitude on their own. And for most of them, actually, this crisis can be treated as an exogenous crisis, as it came just at least mechanically, it came not from the developing world. I think the answer is here is very clear. The national government should be in the driving seat. Then the government is responsible for their country. No donor, no international institution, no external partner can help the government if the government is not ready to drive correctly and consistently. Clearly, international support is important. Who will coordinate this support? Again, national governments. Who will tell the international community how much of support is needed? Only national governments. Who will be able to overcome political frictions with donors before this support can be extended? Only national government. So if there is the point is very simple. Yes, there should be probably more solidarity, more openness, more tools, realistic tools available to developing countries, but it's up to developing countries, to their national governments, more or less, to mobilize these tools. At the same time, international community should be, in my view, very open and transparent in what they expect from national government to achieve. For example, in such sensitive areas as governance, corruption. You can imagine with the amounts of money which is being disbursed now, all governance issues will be front and center right away, including in advanced countries, but also in developing countries. How do we come out of this issue? It's a big question. So this is my answer. Basically, the developing countries should be in the driving seat.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please, you're welcome. Alexey, may I ask you one more question, please? You know, also on your last slide, you mentioned that one of good policies that of international cooperation. Well, I'm not against it, but I quite doubt that this is possible. Probably the real trend will be just opposite. What do you think about that?
You know, it's again one of those dichotomies which has no clear answer. It has to be, it may be both, but it has to be there. And again, my slide with the one world in mask and one economy for the world tells us very clear that there is no other option to international cooperation. Yes, there will be resistance. Yes, there will be scars from the current crisis. Look at Europe, look elsewhere in the world. Yes, there will be blames left and right, you know, who is responsible and who should pay reparations for what. However, if the world has to be managed, and the world has to be managed in a civilized way, not in a medieval way, I would say. I like this word because I feel strongly about it. There should be some form of international cooperation, whether it should be supranational, multinational, regional, or any other. It's a question mark. What would be the most optimal configuration of this this cooperation? Time will tell us. Most likely, in my view, many structures which are redundant in this crisis, they will die, they will disappear, they will vanish. Structures which are important in the crisis, and it's a public crisis, public sector crisis. It's not public health crisis, not only. The structures which will show us that they can handle part of this crisis will survive. And it's not about survival, it's about basically playing an important and useful role in the world. And these structures will stay.
Thank you. Please, colleagues, you are welcome. Here I see. Jamie, please, you are welcome.
I've taken some turns in the chat box, but I'll make a quick question here. It seems to me that one can divide the world, the current division of labor across countries. You have countries that supply advanced capital goods, countries that supply consumers' durables, countries that supply food and natural resources, and countries that supply essential medical equipment. Just as a rough division, I mean, the important things. In the world under the pandemic, practically everything that is not immediately necessary can be deferred. Capital equipment can be deferred. Consumer durables can be deferred. Vehicles can be deferred. So all these things that are produced in the advanced West, they can be deferred. Countries that produce food, and of course, some of the advanced countries produce quite a lot of it. Countries that produce, of course, energy right now is a major, obviously drag on the market, but ultimately it's a necessity. Countries that produce core medical equipment, they're in a strong position. Is this not going to end up essentially in a position where we're in a bilateral world in which the suppliers of basics have really a big change, something of an upper hand to the extent that trade continues at all? People do need to buy at least staple foods. They need to buy the medical supplies. I mean, you notice that these may not be the major items, but their food certainly is. But I don't see how a country that supplies, for example, aircraft, or for example, information technology or financial services, has a strong position in a world in which people are really refocusing on the need to maintain themselves through a period when their basics are essential and other things are not. Any comments?
Yes, sure. Your question is reminds me of a situation in the standard standard world country, let's not even mention any country, basically in any country, wherever you go and talk to the Minister of Finance, when there is a deficit and this deficit cannot be financed in public accounts, what do you cut? And this is exactly the same question. We have only one country in the world now in mask, and this country is running a huge deficit. And basically, your question is, what do we cut in this situation? The answer is always the same. All what I can cut is capital expenditure. I cannot cut anything on current. I cannot cut salaries. I cannot cut procurements of goods and services. I cannot cut interest payments. I cannot cut transfers to regions. I have to cut capital expenditure. These are your aircrafts and so on. I have to cut all of that to be able to balance my budget. It's exactly the same story for the world now. But I mean, then the question is, what next? Multipliers, as we know, fiscal multipliers are much higher in capital expenditure than in consumption expenditure. Then basically what we are saying, if you cut capital expenditure, you have to be ready for protracted recession, multi-year recession, which will not end anytime soon if these are your policies. We understand all constraints, we understand everything. However, you have to be clear in your mind that your denominator, your GDP, will be much lower. All your ratios, including your debt ratio by construction, will be much higher. And what you will do with all of that in the medium and long term, it's a big open question mark. Therefore, it's not an option, in my view, to cut capital expenditure in order to provide health related goods and food, basically food to people. I mean, we have to do both. It's again the same story. We have to manage a very tight budget of this world, of this country, based on good macroeconomic principles. Otherwise, the world will not survive.
I'm not disagreeing with you on the principle, but it does seem to me that we observe that capital expenditure is the first thing to be cut. I don't think people will be buying aircraft, for example, for a long time now. The other thing that gets cut, by the way, of course, as you know, is debt payments. And that's another set of issues which has already been taken up here. But it seems to me very likely that as that scenario unfolds, the private debt payments will be cut. They will simply not happen. And that whole, that's another enormous barrier.
No, I agree. And I mean, debt payments will be, they will be, if there is no debt crisis, and I hope that there will be no debt crisis, but we are very close, frankly speaking. I don't want to sound alarmist, but we are very close to a debt crisis. If, let's say, the debt crisis in advanced economies is avoided, and I hope that it will be avoided, then at least for developing countries, all debt service payments, or most of them, will be either canceled or cut or somehow rescheduled. There will be no these kind of payments. However, there will be still consumption expenditure and there will be still investment expenditure. Yes, at this point, most likely consumption have to prevail, but it cannot prevail indefinitely. All what we are saying now, unfortunately, is that the world has become, in 2 weeks, under our watch, it's unbelievable what was happening, became 10% poorer. If this is the case, if we have to shave off, and this is the best case scenario, it may be much more than that. If we have to shave off 10% of annual output and therefore income for the whole world, we have to accept that all of us will be poor. Let's say by 10%, if this is the only one world. Therefore, there will be no aircraft, or there will be a single aircraft purchased, or maybe not even an aircraft. Maybe it will be a car or a bus or whatever. And there will be food purchase because this is the first staple which has to be consumed and people cannot live without it. But the world, unfortunately, under our watch and because of the failure of public policies, became much poorer now. We have to accept it.
Yeah, well, I certainly don't disagree with the word you're saying. Just that in the case of aircraft or vehicles, it's not public policy making that decision. Airlines decide, people decide whether they're going to buy cars. They'll make that decision based upon the budgets that they face and the change in their prospects. could buy cars for them, but that's really not much of a solution. It's that's not the way the world has worked.
Yeah.
Alexei, I would like to ask you a question. Don't you underestimate the fact that the situation in the on our planet, it's like in a game, because of course you can say that looking at the globe as a single country, then a better solution could have been taken. But in fact, there are very many players on this scene, and national governments are very important players. In prisoner's dilemma, the best result is not also the result which will be achieved. In fact, Nash equilibrium will be not the best result for both prisoners, as we know. But it seems to me that you are a little bit idealistic about the situation on the globe. You are just saying that it would be good if we behaved like that. But it seems as though that there are very few chances that the countries which have suffered so much during this crisis, and they have a lot of, reasons to blame each other for not helping them at the due time and so on. It's quite difficult to imagine right now that all those ruptures in that they could be very fast restored just because it's correct,
Yeah. Yes, I understand the question, and thank you for evoking this prisoner's dilemma issue. Most likely, the outcome, unfortunately, the crisis is very ugly, and the outcome will be suboptimal. It will be, in the best case scenario, second, third, or maybe even fifth best solution. But let's think it through. It's actually very simple, in my view. We have world trade. The world trade in everything, not only in health goods. Now we are calling, at least to make sure that health commodities, health-related commodities are flowing freely among countries. This is important, but it's only 1/10, maybe 1/100th of the problem. All commodities have to flow freely in the integrated world. Why the world, as we know now, of the 21st century, and today is 28th of April of 2020, collapsed in 2 weeks? Because medieval methods were used on an integrated economy. You can use them on disintegrated, on fragmented economies, yes, but you cannot use these methods on integrated economies. The economy collapses. It cannot function like that. Therefore, yes, I am a little bit normative that international cooperation should be there. I must even say it stronger. There is no alternative to it. At this point, there is no alternative to it. It's way too late. We passed the point when the Venice Republic, and I looked at the map actually, during the pandemic of Black Plague, had only two roads in and out. It's not how the world looks now. There are many roads in and out, and if you cut all of them, or even some of them, the whole system collapses. So I clearly see no alternatives. Yeah, there will be blames. There will be blame game, actually. There will be разбор полетов in Russian. I don't know how to say it in English. There will be all of it. But clearly there will be cooperation, and maybe even stronger cooperation going forward. Global value chains will stay and will have to stay. They will not be broken. It's just the issue of elementary efficiency of production, economy of scale, if you want. It's economics 101. Beyond that, I don't see how the world can disintegrate to the point. I mean, politically, yes, maybe there will be fallout. I don't argue about it. But economic pressure will be so hard that clearly integration will be back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Boris, your hand is raised.
No. Thank you. I'm fine. No. Thank you.
Okay. Dear colleagues, who would like to make comments or to
I
ask
have a
questions?
question, Professor.
Oh, yes, Jan William, please.
Hello, Professor. Actually, I'm a student from China and I study in MSc. I have two questions. One is I just write here about the food crisis, because as we know that a lot of countries are limit the export of food rice wheat. So it will be the food crisis in the coming several months, or maybe at least like the food supply crisis. My second question is about that. As we know, in European country or USA, that your quarantine policy, it's not totally like quarantine in the point of view from our Asia countries. In China, Wuhan, we are totally quarantined, and no, we eliminated the virus almost. So what the reason makes so difficult for European countries to implement a very critical totally quarantine to eliminate this virus in this time, not let the virus come to second wave or third wave. So what's the difficult? Because in China we have a word, short period painful is better than long period painful. So if you are coming wave again and again, lockdown again and again, it's more hard. We know it will be very serious to economics. So why not you just do it in this time, just 2 months, and eliminate this virus? So what's the difficulty in Western countries? Thank you.
Yeah, Jan, thank you very much for these two questions. Both are very pertinent. On the first one, on the food crisis, you know, broadly speaking, there is enough of food produced in this world. I showed you that there is only one country. Again, I'm coming back to my picture of one country. If we treat the world as one country, there is enough food for everybody in this one country. If there is a food crisis now, it's because, again, it will be most likely man-made crisis because of restrictions and so on. I don't say that it is not possible. By the way, WTO rules allow to restrict critical exports of critically important goods in the times of crisis. So it's even internationally, it's possible. Yes, it should be temporary, it should be limited to a particular good and so on. There are many restrictions on how to do it, but even legally it is possible. But forget about legalities, let's talk economic. So basically, if food flow is restricted, there will be a crisis. No, there is no doubt about it. And the crisis may be severe, and it will be, again, not completely, but to a substantial extent, man-made crisis as we have now, the crisis related to virus. In terms of the lockdowns, clearly I cannot judge, I'm not an epidemiologist, whether what the options is better or worse in this case. What I can see as an economist, as a macroeconomist, that the attempts to disintegrate an integrated economy are extremely harmful. And it can be okay to isolate one city of Wuhan, which is 18 million population, and I'm sure a major productive city of the country. But the country, China, your country, is very large in terms of output and internal integration connections. Therefore, maybe to take out one link out of the whole system is okay. However, even with that, by the way, it's anecdotal evidence. Do you know what from shelves in grocery stores here in the United States, at least in the area where I live? First, after there was a lockdown in China, only on one city, it's apple juice. Apparently, apple juice produced from concentrate, and the concentrate, all of it produced in China. Somewhere around this city, or I don't know, somehow linked to the supply chain from this city, disappeared from shelves in the United States. I mean, this is how it is integrated. Therefore, our ancestors who did these quarantines for 40 days had a point. They did not know anything about viruses. They didn't know anything about, not very little about diseases, but they just observed that 40 days is the most more or less sustained economically. It's my take on the issue. Economically, you can sustain without destroying livelihood of many more people around than will be destroyed anyway by the virus or epidemic or whatever. Now, if you do a very simple count, I hope that it is based on very strong science, but most countries do not go beyond 40 days. China went to 80, double of it. I mean, yes, it's a precaution, it's a huge place and so on, but most European countries don't go beyond 40. I don't see how it can. Japan is still at an early stage, and they will have to go a little bit maybe longer into the previous. But I really don't see how it can continue even on basic economic grounds. This kind of lockdown.
Thank you, Alexei. Yes, colleagues, some more questions or comments?
Hello, Mr. Alexei.
Yes.
Thank you very much for giving us a very wonderful report. The virus has become the common enemy of human at present. It is still spreading rapidly, except a few countries have controlled the epidemic effectively. It affects people's lives and the economic growth of the world seriously. The people who self-isolate at home for a long time have become boring. And it seems as a paid vacation. Many people don't care about the virus. Also, in the supermarket, is overcrowded. Many people choose their favorite products really without wearing masks. Even traffic jams appeared on the street. All of those caused a high number of infections directly at the result. But people cannot stay at home for a long time. They need to live and work. Can you give us some good suggestions for the prevention and control of epidemic situation? And as an expert and scholar, would you have good ideas to deal with the economic decline of Russia? And can you talk about companies, how to face the impact and the challenges of the epidemic in the current? Thank you.
Sorry, I appreciate there will be a little bit. There was a little bit of echo in transmission. Could you please repeat the question exactly? What is your question? I didn't get it.
I have three questions. First, can you give us some good suggestions for the prevention and control of epidemic situation? What's the question? The second, would you have good ideas to deal with the economic decline of Russia?
Second, I don't understand again. Sorry. What? Can you please do it again? I'm sorry.
In Russia, what do you think?
In Russia, economic decline in Russia.
Yes,
Okay.
Third question, can you talk about companies, how to face the impact and the challenges of the epidemic in the current?
Company. Okay. Fine. So basically, thank you very much for this question. The first one, unfortunately, I am a macroeconomist. I'm not even an economist. I'm a macroeconomist. It's much worse than being an economist. So in macroeconomics, as you know, we don't have numbers. So microeconomists, they do have numbers. And macro, we have very few numbers. Therefore, we have to work with what we have. And clearly, I am not an epidemiologist. So how to control epidemics better, I don't know. But I know what I see when I open the window and look out of the window on the street, and I know what is being done now, and I see that from the macroeconomic standpoint, the containment and confinement measures are extremely damaging. Therefore, I have no way to pass any judgment on whether it is appropriate or not appropriate in this case. All what I am saying that if this is all what public policies can offer us, we have to expect a large crisis, and we have. On Russia, unfortunately, I cannot comment on Russia at all because of my official status. So I can comment only on the position of the world. And if you are interested about Russia and look and want to know what the impact will be on Russia and how, for example, the IMF assesses it, I invite you to talk to resident representative of IMF in Moscow. She will be able to give all the answers on that one. And the impact on individual companies. Again, this is the private sector. This is the private sector, which is very different. And when I say that, again, the same number, that fiscal deficit of minus 13% of GDP, everything is in relation to GDP, has to be financed somehow. It has to be financed by the private sector. There is nobody else. Where is this private sector? Who will give this 13% of GDP to the public sector to fight the crisis in the private sector? Clearly, the private sector is either in the big deficit itself somehow, I mean, or at least part of it. I mean, small and medium-sized enterprises clearly are in the deficit, or there are structural rigidities in the private sector which do not allow to redistribute savings, let's say, between banks, insurance companies, investment companies, and other entities which do accumulate savings to the rest of the private sector. Why does the private sector across the world, I'm not talking about Russia, across the world goes to the government and asks for subsidies, asks for support, asks for transfers, tax relief, you name them. Why is that? Why the private sector, which is supposed to have all these savings, that either does not use these savings or cannot mobilize these savings? Where are these savings? What are the structural rigidities? This is yet another issue which has to be very carefully looked at by economists, and things have to be directed somehow going forward. Otherwise, the global economy as one economy will not be able to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, colleagues, are we going to finish our seminar today, or somebody wants to comment or put questions? Okay, then first of all, I should say that we have to thank our speakers today. They did a big job. Thank you very much, Anton. Thank you very much, Alexei. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for all our colleagues who took part in this discussion. It seemed to me that the discussion is very interesting. In fact, it has begun from the first seminar, and Jamie also sent his article, and we posted it on our website. And there, you know, I was impressed by his position when he was saying that now what is needed would be financed, irrespective of the situation, whether we have money, whether this or that country has money or doesn't have it. But then, of course, the day of reckoning will come. That's also true. And of course, the problem of debts, the problem of monetary overhang, and all those big problems, all those cascading crises, which Alexei, to my mind, so convincingly explained today. Of course, I am afraid, this is my personal view, of course, but I'm afraid that bad times are ahead. Bad times are ahead, and a lot of emphasis people will will try to base their actions on their own efforts because they have seen the risk of interdependence. Because what we face now is just the result of that risk which has materialized in all those losses. Of course, it doesn't mean that in the long run the situation will not return to what we call normal or something like that, but for the near future, well, I think, by the way, that Anton's idea also was that we are going to face the period when emphasis will be replaced from foreign exchange, foreign trade ties to internal relations and so on. Unfortunately, it seems that this is quite inevitable, though this is far from optimum, of course, nobody does. So this was just my personal view, of course, nothing more, but in any case, I think everybody who took part in this discussion, and I invite you to join us on May 8th, when we'll have presentations by Sergei Rogov and Jan-Art Scholte. So be healthy, take care. Bye.
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 Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.